All right, let's unpack those a little bit. But before I get to that, I just wanted to ask a question. Have you seen the movie City Slickers? I wanted to show you a video clip from it this morning until I rewatched it, and it was quite peppered with swear words, so I didn't think I should use it in church. But instead, I'll describe this scene between Jake Palas and Billy Crystal's characters are riding along, talking about life and the meaning of life and what's important. And Jack asks Billy, he goes, "Do you know what the secret to life is?" And Billy goes, "No, what?" And Jack holds up his finger like this, and Billy goes, "What, your finger?" He goes, No. One thing, just one thing. You stick to that one thing and everything else means nothing. Billy answers, "That's great, but what's the one thing?" And Jack says, "Well, that's what you got to figure out. That's what you got to figure out." I was reading an article about the one thing, and it referred to the 7 habits of highly effective people, which has a great line in it that says, "The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing." But it's a bit like Billy's question, but what is that main thing? What is the one thing that makes life make sense? And that's what this sermon series is exploring a little bit. It's exploring this phrase that only happens 5 times in the Bible. Well, it actually happens about a dozen times, but only 5 times in this context where it's talking about the most important thing in life. Only 5 times. And it's said in 5 by different people in different contexts. And what we're going to be exploring, whether it's the Apostle Paul or the King David or Martha or the rich young ruler, they're all trying to work out this one thing. What is the one thing? So last week we looked at King David and Psalm 27, and we sort of explored how David was not in a great place, and he was in a time of doubt, blaming himself, being criticised by other people, even attacked by other people. And David sort of, in this dark place, had a choice of whether or not he wanted to get angry with God or push God away, or to, the phrase we've been using lately is lean into God and be embraced by God's love. And in response, David wrote Psalm 27, which has the line, "The one thing I seek, the one thing I seek is to be in God's presence, to dwell in the house of the Lord." David had a choice, and he chose to be close to God, which really is the only choice he could have made, isn't it? This is going back to Mal's kids' talk. When you're choosing between a good thing, being close to God or in God's presence, and a bad thing, being angry at God and rejecting God and walking away, it's a pretty clear choice of which one to make. But that's unlike the Bible readings that we had today. The choices there are not quite as clear cut. Mary and Martha had a choice, but it wasn't choosing between a good thing and a bad thing. It was choosing between a number of good things. And that's the difficulty that we face when we start to talk about prioritising things in our life. If everything was just black and white or clearly good and bad, then all these choices are easy to make. But life is not like that. Life is more like trying to balance giving your best to your career versus giving your best to your family versus giving your best to God. All those things are good. So how do you prioritise one over the other? Well, to explore this, we're going to deep dive into these 2 Bible readings and see what they have to say to us, or what God might reveal to us through those readings. Let's start with Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha. And you may remember that last year I actually did a sermon series called Perspectives, and I used Mary and Martha as an example in one of the sermons about there's a whole lot of different perspectives we looked at in that sermon about, the priorities or the need to be in the presence of Jesus or the impact of worries in distorting the way that we think. Or even I shared a perspective about how this story might not even be about housework, but more about ministry, and how Martha is the town pastor asking Jesus to tell Mary, who's more like a missionary or a wandering pastor, to come back to the hometown and help ministry there. If you're interested in learning about those perspectives, you can go to our website where all the previous sermons for, I think, the last 3 years are there. Actually, there's the link on the screen. If you go to /sermons/perspectives, you will find the sermon I'm talking about. But today we're trying to hold together the decision of Mary to sit at Jesus' feet versus Martha's decision to busy herself with the needs, with what needs to be done. Why does Jesus affirms Mary's decision over Martha's? Because we're just talking about, the one thing, let's go to actually that Bible passage in the reading from Luke 10. So here it is. I've got it here from the New Living Translation because it had the phrase "the one thing." So I've used that version. From 41 and 42, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, "You are worried and upset about many things, but a few things are needed." Really, only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and that will not be taken away from her. Did you notice the transition in this Bible passage? It starts off by saying to Martha, "You are worried about many things. But then Jesus says, "But only a few are needed." Worried about many things, but only a few are needed. And then he transitions into actually only one thing is needed. Only one thing is needed. There's this progression from being worried about lots of stuff to how do we focus down to only a few things to the one thing. Actually, these verses in the Greek take this line even a step further. That line, "Mary has chosen what is better," if we looked at in the original Greek, another way of interpreting that is not Mary has chosen the one thing that is better, but Mary has portioned these things better, or Mary has allocated shares of these things better or in a good way. Almost saying that Mary's balance of the different priorities that she's trying to work through, she's done that well. And I actually quite find this helpful, because in my life I struggle with trying to find the right balance between many, many good things that I want to do. I have a problem saying yes to too many good things. I'm not saying yes to bad things. All the stuff that I want to be involved in or do or invest into are good. But what I hear from this idea of the Greek is not having to dump all the good things and just choose the one thing I need to be a part of, but to first work out, what are the few things that are really important to focus on? Yes, there are many things, but what are the few things that are really important? And how do I assign greater portion or, a greater share of my time or focus onto those things? And maybe even work out, as Jesus said, maybe really there's only one thing I really should be investing the majority of my portions or focus onto. Does that sort of make sense? If we take that idea across to the other reading, which is the rich young ruler, unfortunately that idea doesn't quite match with that scenario, because on the surface, this young man has actually got his portions not too bad at all. You would actually argue that he's done pretty good. It says here that ever since he was a boy, he has made God's law a priority in his life, following God's law. which in the Old Testament understanding of what you had to do in that time is how you were right with God. You followed God's law. And he's openly saying, well, I have done this. This is what my life has been focused on, trying to do my best to follow God's laws ever since I was a boy. He has kept the 10 Commandments. He has spent his life committed to following the way of God. And actually, Jesus doesn't criticize that at all. Actually, he goes on to say that Jesus looked at him with love. It's almost like going, yes, that is what you're supposed to do. You've got your focus right. So whereas Mary and Martha had the phrase, one thing is needed, with the rich young ruler, the line is more, there is one thing that you lack. One thing that you lack. I don't think Jesus is criticising his focus on the 10 Commandments or his focus in following God's law, but rather, with that good focus, he is still missing something. There's something that he needs to portion in or add into that mix of priorities, because he's saying there's one thing that you lack. Often preachers use this idea of the rich young ruler to talk about the sacrifices that we have to make in our following of Jesus. But I think that Jesus affirming to the young man is doing good. It's not about his lack of desire to sacrifice, but rather that he's missing something. He's missing something in his life. Maybe that's that generosity to people who he needs to share his blessings with. But if we go back to the Greek here as well, if you look at the Greek here for the word lack, it's the same Greek word that you would use if you fell behind in a race, or if you were late to a party, if you were missing out on something, if you were not quite there reaching the mark. It's almost like saying that, yes, the one thing you lack, you're just not quite getting there in the fullness of life that Jesus is offering because you're missing something. And so, is this idea a universal idea that Jesus is saying to all people? Or is it just a particular thing that Jesus is saying to the rich young ruler? Well, I think for all of us that the idea of the one thing you lack is a universal idea. Maybe we all have to consider, is there something that, we're doing good things in our life, but is there something that we're missing that's just stopping us experiencing the fullness of life that Jesus is offering? The particular thing that Jesus was talking to that young man about, giving all his wealth to the poor, maybe that's the more individual thing, but this idea of the one thing that you lack is something that maybe we all have to work through. For the rich young ruler, one thing he was lacking was his inability to share his blessing with others. And that held him back in what he could have experienced in following Jesus fully. What's the one thing that's holding us back? Is there something that we need to add into our mix of priorities to unlock an even greater sense of growth? So how do I hold these two sermons together? Because really, each of these stories are raising different points. With King David, the question was, well, what's most important in our lives? What do we seek above all? And in David's experience, he was saying, I seek the presence of God above all. Whereas the message from Mary and Martha was different. It was more like, we try and carry so many things and so many good things, priorities in our lives, but maybe only a few are needed. And how do we work out what those few are? And even within those few, how do we work out how we portion our focus or our energy or our time on these priorities? in a way which is good. Where this rich young ruler had yet another different way of understanding the one thing, which is not necessarily about how do we focus down on one thing, but is there one thing that we're lacking in our life that's holding us back from experiencing the fullness of life that Jesus is offering? Can you see already? We've still got 2 more of these to go, and they will bring another way of understanding this one thing. I guess the challenge for us is to work out how we respond to these. You know, in the story, unfortunately, we don't know how Mary and Martha responded to the conversation that Jesus had. We hope that maybe they both might have reevaluated their life or their portioning of their priorities. Maybe Martha went, you know what, I probably can do a little bit more listening and a little bit less serving. We do know the response of the young man who felt like he couldn't add that sense of generosity or giving into his life and walked away. He couldn't see that was actually the one thing he lacked and walked away. I said at the beginning of last week's sermon that for many of us, this time of lockdown is an opportunity for us to do some reevaluating. And I encourage you to reflect upon your own priorities, your own portioning. Is there too many things that we are worried about? Do we need to shrink that down to a few? Is there anything that we're lacking that we need to add in? And just as Jesus guided Mary and Martha and this young man in their decision making, I pray that we will be open to Jesus guiding us as well. Amen.